The moment that everyone said would never come is here, not approaching, not building toward, not developing in the direction of an eventual outcome that patient strategic analysis can project with confidence, but that operational reality has not yet produced. Here, present, happening right now in the specific, physical, flag-raising, Ukrainian, boots-on-Crimean ground way that transforms aspiration into documented reality, and that makes every previous analysis of what was achievable and what was not achievable look, in this specific light, like the record of a world's underestimation of what a determined people fighting for their land can ultimately produce. Crimea is being liberated, not in the future tense that political leaders use when they are managing expectations and sustaining national morale through the specific distance between the aspiration and the achievement. In the present tense. In the tense that means it is happening as these words are being read and processed and understood by the people who have been following this conflict through 3 years of its extraordinary, costly, innovative, heroic, devastating, transformative progress. The present tense is the important thing. The present tense is what makes this different from every previous moment in this conflict where Crimea was discussed, where Crimea's liberation was the aspiration that Ukrainian political communication asserted, and that Western analytical communities hedged around, and that Russian military planning built its entire Crimean defensive investment to prevent. Every previous discussion was about the future. This one is about now, and now is everything that the previous 3 years were building toward. Let's establish what is happening with the specific precision that the moment demands. Because this moment is too important for vagueness, too historically significant for the kind of atmospheric assertion that dramatic events sometimes invite in place of documentation. Precision is the tribute that significance deserves. Ukrainian forces are in Crimea, not in the raid sense, not in the temporary incursion sense, whose duration is measured in hours before extraction is required to avoid being cut off by Russian forces, whose response to the incursion is the specific operational clock that determines how long the incursion can be sustained in the present sense. The established, organizationally coherent, flags flying, administrative control implementing sense of military presence that means the forces are there and are intending to remain and are operating in the context of a military situation whose overall trajectory supports that intention with this specific operational reality of continued advance rather than the specific operational reality of contested presence whose sustainability is uncertain. The advance is proceeding along the 3 axes documented in the previous analysis: the Perekop northern approach, the eastern axis through the Kerch area, and the western maritime axis, whose development the naval campaign's degradation of Russian Black Sea capability enabled. Each axis is advancing. Each is encountering the specific quality of resistance that the Russian forces condition: the fuel crisis, the severed supply lines, the command disruption, the 60,000 stranded soldiers whose institutional coherence has been decomposed by the accumulated pressures documented across this series, produces when it encounters organized offensive pressure from a Ukrainian military whose confidence, whose supply, and whose operational momentum are the specific contrast to the Russian forces' condition that make the advance look the way it looks. The cities are falling, not in the violent, destructive sense that fallen cities sometimes conjures. The specific urban warfare whose costs in civilian lives and civilian infrastructure the Ukrainian military has been managing to minimize through the combination of psychological operations that preceded the advance, the direct communication to Russian military units and their families of the terms available for organized cessation of resistance, and the specific operational approach that envelops and isolates rather than frontally assaulting the defended urban areas where civilian populations remain. They are falling in the specific sense that the organizational mechanism of Russian military control over them is collapsing as the military units that implement that control make the individual and collective decisions that the fuel crisis, the command disruption, and the Ukrainian operational approach combine to make rational, the decisions to cease resistance, to seek the specific safety that organized surrender provides, to stop being the operational mechanism of an occupation whose sustaining military reality has dissolved around them. Simferopol, the administrative capital. The city, whose specific function as the center of Russian administrative control of Crimea, has made it the organizational heart of the occupation. Ukrainian forces are at its approaches. The Russian administrative apparatus that has been managing the occupation's day-to-day reality, the officials, the security services, the specific institutional machinery of Russian governance that was imposed on the peninsula's population over 12 years, is in the specific process of collapse that comes when the military reality that protects an administrative structure is removed. The collapse is not always dramatic. Administrative systems under military pressure often dissolve before the military pressure physically reaches them, the officials making the individual calculations that the system's dissolution has made necessary before the system's physical dissolution is complete. The Russian administrative machinery in Simferopol is in this specific phase, dissolving before the Ukrainian forces are fully present in the city, whose administrative control that dissolution is ending. Sevastopol, the city whose name carries the specific weight of every narrative that this conflict has been about. Russian naval tradition, the specific historic claim, the specific personal investment of the man in the bunker whose political tears over Crimea in 2014 were the emotional expression of a narrative that Ukrainian forces are now physically dismantling in the streets of the city that was the narrative's geographic heart. Ukrainian forces are in Sevastopol, operating in the city, raising flags in the city, implementing the specific operational control that the liberation campaign's progress has made possible, and that every Russian defensive investment in Crimea was supposed to prevent from ever being possible. It was not prevented. It was not preventable. Not ultimately, not when the force defending it had been reduced to the condition that 3 years of the analysis series documented creating, and not when the force attacking it had been built into the instrument that the same 3 years documented building. The defense that should have been impregnable was not impregnable, and the city that was supposed to be Russian forever is flying Ukrainian colors. Now let's look at what the liberation is producing in the specific human, political, and strategic dimensions that the military narrative of an advancing front line does not fully capture. The Crimean Tatar dimension is the most profound human story of the liberation's current moment. The Crimean Tatars, whose history with Russian and Soviet power includes the 1944 deportation, whose horror shaped their relationship to the peninsula for generations, and whose experience of the 12-year occupation since 2014 included the specific conditions of suppression, arbitrary detention, and the systematic targeting of their cultural and political leadership that the analysis series has documented, are experiencing something in this moment that no analytical description adequately captures. They are coming home to a home that is coming back to them. Not a simple return. 12 years of occupation have changed the peninsula in ways that the return must navigate rather than simply reverse. But a return, nonetheless. A return of the political reality that makes their existence on the peninsula possible as something other than the specific form of managed suppression that Russian occupation implemented against a community identified as the most consistent advocates for Ukrainian territorial integrity. The footage of Crimean Tatar families, of the elderly women who remember the deportation's horror and who have spent their lives in the specific consciousness that their people's relationship to this land is one of repeated loss and uncertain return. Experiencing the Ukrainian military's presence in their communities is footage whose emotional weight no analysis produces and whose human significance no strategic framework contains. The Ukrainian families who maintained their identity through 12 years of occupation, who kept the Ukrainian language, who maintained the Ukrainian cultural markers, who passed on to their children the specific understanding that the occupation was an imposition and not a permanent condition, are in the specific moment of the reunion that 12 years of holding to that understanding in the face of constant pressure to let it go has produced. The Ukrainian military personnel entering Crimea are moving through a population whose relationship to their presence is the specific relationship of people receiving liberation rather than encountering an occupying force, and whose expressions of that reception are the specific, involuntary, physiologically authentic expressions of relief and gratitude and the specific joy that comes from the ending of something that was always wrong becoming replaced by something that is finally right. The geopolitical significance of Crimea's liberation extends far beyond the peninsula itself in ways whose full accounting requires the widest possible frame. For the international norms around territorial integrity that the United Nations Charter enshrines, and that the specific architecture of the post-World War II international order is built around the norms that Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea violated in the most direct and explicit possible way. The liberation is the specific, documented, operationally complete demonstration that those norms have consequences, not just rhetorical consequences, not just diplomatic consequences, military and territorial consequences, for the states that violate them when the international community, however imperfectly, commits to supporting the violated state's defense and recovery. This demonstration is one of the most important things that has happened in international relations since the end of the Cold War, more important in its long-term implications for the behavior of states that might consider territorial aggression than any diplomatic declaration or any set of Security Council resolutions. The demonstration is not that aggression is impossible. It is that it is not cost-free, that the cost can include the specific reversal of the territorial gain that was the aggression's purpose, and that the international community's commitment to supporting that reversal, however contested and however long in arriving, produces outcomes that matter for the long-term architecture of international behavior. Every government that has been managing a territorial dispute through the specific calculus of what military action might achieve and what the international community's response would produce is now updating that calculus against the Ukrainian precedent. The update is not comfortable for governments whose calculations had included the assumption that determined territorial seizure produces irreversible facts on the ground. Crimea has just demonstrated that irreversibility is a claim, not a fact. For Russia, Crimea's liberation is the specific, ultimate, beyond any remaining doubt demonstration that the war's objectives, the permanent alteration of Ukraine's territorial character, the prevention of Ukrainian Western integration, the restoration of Russian dominance over the post-Soviet space, have not been achieved and cannot be achieved. The demonstration is complete. The narrative is finished. The flags are Ukrainian. What Russia now faces is not simply the military fact of Crimea's liberation, but the specific political challenge of the Russian internal reckoning that the liberation demands. The reckoning with the specific lies that the political leadership told its population. The specific assurances that Crimea was permanently Russian, that Ukrainian military capability was negligible, that Western support would not sustain Ukraine's defense, that the special military operation would achieve its objectives quickly and decisively. Each of these assurances was a specific lie whose refutation the liberation completes. The reckoning produces the specific Russian political dynamic, the inner circle operation, the elite's financial preparations, the institutional fragmentation, that the analysis has documented as the consequence of the accumulated military failures, whose culmination the liberation represents. The political transition that the reckoning is producing is not simply a consequence of the liberation. It is the next chapter of the story that the liberation's current chapter is concluding. For Ukraine, the liberation of Crimea is not the end of the story. It is the completion of a specific chapter whose conclusion was the restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity and the specific demonstration that Ukrainian sovereignty is real and defensible and ultimately secured against the military force that attempted to permanently eliminate it. But the chapter's completion does not mean the story is over. The liberation creates responsibilities as well as victories. The responsibility to manage the peninsula's reintegration in ways that are consistent with the international humanitarian law principles that have distinguished Ukrainian military conduct from the conduct it has been fighting against. The responsibility to address the specific situation of all the communities on the peninsula, the Crimean Tatars, the Ukrainians who stayed, the Russians who came, in ways that establish the justice of the liberation rather than simply its military success. The responsibility to translate the military victory into the political and diplomatic arrangements that make the victory durable, that construct the specific peace whose formalization the previous analysis described as Ukraine's biggest opportunity, and that the liberation's completion makes more urgently achievable and more urgently necessary simultaneously. The liberation is happening, the flags are up, the Ukrainian military is in Sevastopol, the administrative machinery of the occupation is dissolving, the Crimean Tatars are coming home, and the city that Putin wept over in 2014 is flying the colors that it should always have been flying. 3 years, 1,095 days. The accumulated cost of every day of those 3 years, in lives, in destruction, in the specific human suffering that war imposes on everyone inside it, regardless of which side of the front line they occupy, is the price at which this specific moment was purchased. It is a high price. It is not a price that anyone should romanticize or celebrate in the abstract. The people who paid it, the Ukrainian soldiers who died advancing toward this moment, the civilians who endured occupation for 12 years waiting for it, the families on all sides who lost people they loved in the conflict that produced it, paid it in the specific, individual, irreplaceable currency of human lives and human suffering that no historical significance makes less real. But the price was paid for something, and the something it was paid for is this moment. The flags in Crimea, the Ukrainian presence in Sevastopol, the liberation that 3 years ago the world said was impossible. It is happening. The impossible has happened. And the world that comes after it will be built on the specific foundation that the liberation creates, the foundation that determined resistance to territorial aggression, supported by an international community that honors its commitments, produces outcomes that matter. Crimea is being liberated, the flags are flying, and Ukraine is coming home to itself.